You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and I'm Chevy Lynn Vasky with the K-State Radio Network. We begin Tuesday's show with K-State, Drew Ricketts, and Joe Gerken, and part of their Fins, Fur, and Feathers podcast as they discuss benefits of burning and managing different types of ecosystems. Dorivar Ruiz Diaz, K-State soil fertility specialist, keeps the show rolling as he explains what nutrients wheat growers should test for in their fields to be ready for the next season. K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk ends today's show discussing the health risks associated with drinking raw milk and how pasteurization helps protect consumers from the risk of foodborne illnesses. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start today's show with part of a Fins, Fur, and Feathers podcast episode with K-State's Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken.
A woodland and a forest, are there different species there, different amounts? What makes a woodland or a forest, I guess? Talk about that. Maybe there are other descriptions we can use too.
Yeah. So those terms refer basically to how much tree cover is there, and specifically how much sunlight is being intercepted by the canopies of those trees before it gets to the ground. And I think one of the things when we think about habitat management, we're thinking about the critters. If we're thinking more deeply, maybe we're thinking about the plants, the trees, the forbs, the grasses, the different plants that we're trying to promote to support the wildlife. But there's a few things that are really driving that, right? And one of the really, really important things is sunlight. Another really important one's rainfall. But, whether you're in a hardwood system, whether you're in a softwood system, whether you're in a prairie or a desert, what is one of the deciding factors on what you're actually looking at is how dense the canopy is of woody vegetation. And so if we look at a prairie, that's going to be an area that's dominated by less than 10% tree cover. A savanna, which is a term that a lot of people have probably heard, is between 10% and 30% tree cover. And it tends to have a really well-developed herbaceous layer, meaning the non-woody plants that are down on the ground. So lots of grasses, lots of forbs down below. A good example of that might be the cross timbers area down around Fall River between maybe Yates Center and Kansas, kind of on the eastern edge of the southern Flint Hills or the Chautauqua Hills. We have those oak savannas down there. And it's relatively open, and it supports a lot of prescribed fire for cattle production. The next classification is one that you mentioned already. That's a woodland. And so a woodland would have somewhere between 30 and 80% canopy cover of woody plants. And then a forest is above 80%. So that's that really deep, dark area that not very much sunlight is getting through at all.
Yeah. Does the type of trees matter in those classifications, or just the amount?
It's just the amount in those classifications. But along with those, we might say that we had mixed hardwood woodlands, and that would mean that it was dominated by hardwoods, but it's got some non-deciduous tree species out there. Or we may just have hardwood systems, which are wooded areas in Kansas are supposed to be mostly hardwoods. Right? We don't have a lot of non-hardwood woodlands in Kansas. One of the interesting things that we see with those shade-tolerant species, too, is they tend to be fire intolerant, and that's before they get established. So if we're burning on a fairly regular basis, you wouldn't see many elms or green.
In Great Plains area, at least, that, fire is beneficial for prairies. But when you talk about it with forest, I think that's really, it's almost a novel idea. People know about it. We're not actively thinking about it a lot of times. What should a fire regime look like in these areas?
Yeah, thinking about historical conditions, our woodlands in Kansas would have probably burned every 2 to 3 years historically. They would have had a little bit shorter fire return interval than tallgrass prairie, and probably a longer fire return interval than a lot of the mixed grass and short grass stuff as you move further and further west. the interesting thing about fire and sunlight and rainfall and how all that stuff plays together in these woodland systems is that a fire alone with a relatively closed canopy where we don't have a lot of sunlight getting to the forest floor.
And that's over 80%, or what would you consider a closed canopy?
Well, yeah, I mean, over 80% would be closed canopy, but even if we've got, let's say, 60% or more of a canopy cover in our woodlands, you know, if we're running a fire through there, we might be able to get it to burn, but it doesn't do it. You won't see nearly the same response as if we opened it up even more and had a whole bunch of sunlight coming through. Trees that might be providing important food like white oaks and red oaks and some of the hickories and pecans and those mast-producing trees or trees that produce a nut or a soft fruit, we're going to preserve those. We're not going to kill all of those. In a lot of the Great Plains, we'd be growing blackberries, black raspberries, probably lots of grapevine, probably lots of greenbrier. All those plants are really going to provide a lot of food and cover at the same time. That herbaceous layer that was absent before. And a way to kind of see that, what that might look like a lot of times, when we've got an area of woods, when you get to the edge of it and you're standing right at the edge, it might look like it's got a good understory. There might be all kinds of shrubs and herbaceous plants right there on the edge. Walk in 10 feet. But once we get into where that horizontal sunlight's no longer getting to, then we're blocking all that sun, and so there's nothing growing. So that can kind of show you the power of thinning things down. And then once we've thinned it down to where we have all those other plants growing, now when we send a prescribed fire through there, we've got fuel, and we see a lot of the same benefits that we would see of a prescribed fire out in a grassland system. You know, you're removing that standing vegetation. You're regenerating a whole bunch of new vegetation that's more palatable, more nutritious than the old stuff that was standing there, easier to digest for the critters that are going to eat it. And we're also setting back, top killing at least, those woody plants that are shade tolerant and fire intolerant that we don't want to be growing and replacing. And when we send a fire across a young oak tree or a hackberry tree or an elm tree or a honey locust tree, most of the time we're not killing the root system. We're just killing what's above ground. And then as soon as it can after the fire, that may be the next growing season. If the fire is in the spring, then it's going to be in a month, but it's going to start sending up new shoots, right? And if you've ever done that, if you've ever been pasture clearing or cut some trees in the woods and you would normally treat the stumps, but you forget to treat a stump, most of the time when we come back next year, it looks like a little bonsai tree because it's sprouted and those deer have been hammering all that new growth, right? Well, what's happened there is you've taken that large root system and now that tree is putting the same amount of nutrients into those little bitty twigs and leaves that it used to put into a tree. Crammed all those nutrients into such a small amount of vegetation, and so we've made them more nutritious. Well, fire does that too, and that's one of the really cool things about opening things up, running a fire through there. We just create so much food and cover in a space that before was a canopy for birds to be in, and it was a little bit of cover for those critters to be in, but now we've transformed it into an incredibly amount of more cover, but also an incredible amount of food that's available to them as well.
So there's obviously a lot of benefits to wildlife to doing all this. You've mentioned thinning out the forest quite a few times. Is that as simple as going in and just taking a chainsaw and cutting out trees? I mean, is it literally what it sounds like?
Yeah.
Chop them all down?
It is that simple, and there's different ways to do it. So what tends to be the most beneficial in a lot of situations, you know, if you've got an area that most of the trees that we're wanting to kill are 6 inches at breast height or larger, so like 5 or 5.5 feet off the ground, the diameter of the trees are 6 inches, then actually killing that tree and leaving it standing is most of the time the best thing to do.
How would you do that?
So there's two ways. One of them, the old tried and true method, is girdling. And so you could take a chainsaw and make a ring in the bark with that chainsaw, and we're just getting through the bark just barely, because that vascular tissue, the veins in the tree that's sending water up and bringing nutrients back down to the roots from the leaves, they're right underneath the bark. If you make a couple of those that are, let's say, 2 inches apart, then a lot of the trees that we do that to will slowly die over time. Some trees that are very vigorous might actually grow new bark over those cuts and heal up. And so we might not actually do much damage to those trees. But if you want to make sure that you get them killed, then we can make that ring, and then we can put some herbicide in that cut that is labeled for cut surface treatment. That's one way. And if you've got bigger and bigger trees, then oftentimes girdling is the quicker way. If most of the trees that we're killing, let's say, are 10 inches or less at breast height, then it might be quicker to do what they call hack and squirt. And that would be where you go in with a hatchet, make half a dozen cuts around that tree at breast height with your hatchet all the way around the circumference of the tree, and then we squirt some of that cut surface herbicide into those cuts that we made with our hatchet.
Once again, that was K-State, Drew Ricketts, and Joe Gerken with a part of their Fens, Fur, and Feathers podcast episode. If you're interested in listening to the full podcast, you can find it in today's show notes. We are cutting to a short break now, but we'll have more for you up ahead on Agriculture Today.
You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show discussing soil fertility and wheat production with K-State Soil Fertility Specialist Dorivar Ruiz Diaz. Dorivar, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
Dorivar, as we're thinking about wheat fertility and soil, what's the first big step for growers?
Yes, we are that time of the year. We need to be planning fertility or fertility program. And this is really the time to be thinking about this and make sure we have the right information to make the right decisions. Obviously, big implications in terms of the budget, the investment we may be putting in fertility. So we need to have the right information. So that really starts with soil testing. And we need to have the right testing for the right nutrients. And again, the cost of sampling, the cost of that analysis is really nothing compared to the implications of that in terms of what we're doing, fertilizer recommendations and how many pounds and what nutrients and so on. So that would be the first step. For sure, we need to be collecting samples. I like to think about these two main groups of nutrients that we need to consider. One is really your immobile nutrients, where we need to be collecting samples. Typically, the surface 0 to 6 inches. Some people do 0 to 7, depending on what recommendation you're following. K-State recommendations is based on the 0 to 6 inches. And so that's going to be your immobile nutrients, phosphorus in particular. And remember, winter wheat really, really responds well to phosphorus. So we really need to pay attention to this. pH as well. We need to pay attention to that. If we see where we are, we need to be considering some lime applications in some cases. We still have time for that. In many cases, we need to be looking, depending on where you are, potassium as well. That's another nutrient that we need to consider. And then we have other key parameters that we also use for recommendation. One of them is soil organic matter, because that's going to have implication for potential nitrogen supply. So we need to have that information as well. So really those kind of the key ones there, I would say basic is pH, phosphorus, potassium, organic matter. And so those are the ones that I would focus on primarily, and the ones that maybe provide more return to investment. So that's the first group on that 0 to 6 inch sample. And then the other group of mobile nutrients in the soil, where we really need to have more of a profile sampling. Those are going to be residual nitrate, okay, sulfur, and chloride. And all of these three elements, three nutrients, are very important for us in Kansas for winter wheat. We do see very good response to sulfur, same for chloride, especially if you are in that kind of central part of the state. Very consistent response to chloride as well there. And of course, nitrogen. We want to know what we have residual there. And based on that, again, if we do have some residual, we can take advantage of that and make adjustments to nitrogen application later in this winter or in the spring for top dressing. So those are the key ones that we need to pay attention to. And again, having that soil test information at this point is going to be the first step.
Are there nutrients that you often see growers having an issue with in parts of the state?
Yes, and of course, again, we're talking about return to investment, especially yield response. I mentioned earlier, phosphorus is one that we need to pay close attention. And one of them is the level of phosphorus. Winter wheat just, again, has a higher critical value than corn or soybean. So we need to maintain that. But another factor is placement of that phosphorus. So if we're thinking about planning for fertility program this fall and how are we going to be putting fertilizer, really ideally if we can put dry fertilizer with the drill, that's the best approach. Again, wheat is just very responsive to that phosphorus, especially if it is applied with the seed. And so again, that's a really excellent practice, and I highly recommend that for many reasons. Obviously, the response, but also the placement itself is minimizing any losses. We are putting that fertilizer, basically injecting that fertilizer below the surface, so potential for any runoff or any losses is minimal. So that's really in terms of efficiency. And so that's one key nutrient there. And of course, again, nitrogen. In the case of nitrogen, is something that's always interesting because, as you know, we don't use a lot of nitrogen in the fall and winter months because there's little growth. And the nitrogen uptake obviously is very limited because we don't have too much of that growth. So that's the reason why we usually try to put nitrogen later in the top dressing time. But we still need a little bit of nitrogen to get the establishment, tillering, and just establishment this fall. I usually like to see somehow between 20 and 30 pounds of nitrogen if it's possible. And so that's something that I often try to emphasize. And there's not an easy way to do that, unfortunately, because it's a small amount. But if we are putting phosphorus already, that's going to have some nitrogen with it. We're using MAP or DAP, and that may be already taking care of that need. I also mentioned the nitrogen testing. In many cases, we already have enough there to provide that early growth at 20 or 30 pounds of nitrogen. So those are two key factors I like to pay attention to. Like I said, the nitrogen, we don't need a lot, and my preference is really to wait until top dressing. That's ideal to put the main application of nitrogen, because again, it gives us a better idea of where we are, yield potential, moisture, and so on. But again, we just need a little bit of nitrogen this fall to get that establishment, tillering, and getting that cropping with a good start.
Are nutrient needs different if a grower is planting their wheat just for grain versus if they're planting it for grain and grazing cattle?
That's an excellent question. And yes, the needs are different. We do need higher application rates and timing of that nitrogen as well for grazing. And so we need to plan that accordingly. Of course, I mentioned that we don't take a lot of nitrogen in the fall, but if we're grazing, we do want to have significant, very good growth, right? Because we're going to use that for grazing, and nitrogen is going to be a key factor there. And so in that case, we need to plan ahead. We need to put higher nitrogen application. And again, we just need to evaluate that and make that adjustment. For sure, we need more nitrogen in this case. Ahead of planting to have that early growth. And then obviously, if we are doing dual purpose, if we are going back to grain later on, we're going to have to come back, top dressing before joining and put another shot of nitrogen there to get that crop going. And so that's one key factor there in the case of dual purpose if we are doing grazing, which again, we're seeing quite a bit more in Kansas as well, which is a good thing. It's a good opportunity that we can take advantage of. In this particular case also, I will encourage again to pay more attention to putting phosphorus with the seed, because again, phosphorus we don't think about that very much, but again, the growth and establishment, that will also contribute to more forage production as well early in the fall. So not just that nitrogen, but also that phosphorus application.
Is there a reason to ever soil test after maybe you've applied some nutrients or in the middle of wheat growing season?
Well, ideally, we want to do all of this ahead of time, and the only reason why we may do that is because maybe we didn't have the time to soil sample, and in some cases we can still get some good information there. But again, some of the especially the immobile nutrients, phosphorus, and so on, is not going to provide the same benefit after planting. But then other nutrients, again, we haven't talked too much about sulfur, for example. If we are able to we're not able to sample now and we come back maybe later, we can evaluate, see where we are in the case of sulfur. Sulfur is something that we can top dress. It's a mobile nutrient. So we can easily make decisions on that later in the spring. And so again, that would be another nutrient that, yes, will still have value to get that sample and again make decisions later in the season. So that's again, like I say, we're seeing significant response to sulfur in winter wheat. We really need to pay attention to that. So again, sampling, if we're not able to do that now, I think we can still get some value later on.
Focus back towards nitrogen. You have done some K-State trials, and what have you seen for different levels of nitrogen application in relation to grain yield?
Yes, we done some really we're talking fall residual soil nitrate, and the studies we done is sample, the values can range significantly, and we've seen samples ranging from say 10 pounds of nitrogen all the way over 100 pounds of nitrogen that can be available there. And so this is good information to have. Obviously, if we happen to have 100 pounds of nitrogen in that profile, that's free nitrogen that we better know is there. Obviously, is going to be a key. Now, the question I often get is that, is the wheat crop going to really see that nitrogen there? And yes, we do have, our study shows that just like what you see in that nitrogen response to fertilizer, that response curve that we usually see, the same way we see that response as well to that residual nitrogen in the soil. So that's going to be available for the crop. We do see nice response to that. And so again, is key information to have. And I emphasize when we have high nitrogens, but on the flip side also, when you have low nitrogen, we need to know that as well. Remember that if we don't have this information, we use a default number, which is usually 30 pounds of nitrogen. And in many cases, we may have less than that. This year, we have some good rains, some good yielding potential in some cases. So it's possible that we may have very little residual in some soils. And again, that is information that we need to know in the case of low residual, that maybe we need to up our nitrogen rates a little bit moving forward.
Dorivar, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you.
That was K-State Soil Fertility Specialist Dorivar Ruiz Diaz. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be right back.
Welcome back to Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner and Chevy Lynn Vasky, I'm Jeff Wickman. We end today's program with this week's milk lines. Health officials in Florida are warning people about the dangers of drinking raw milk after an outbreak linked to a single farm. K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk says the consumption of raw milk, especially for young children and older adults, poses a health risk because raw milk can harbor dangerous bacteria.
Today I'd like to visit with our Kansas dairy producers as well as dairy consumers from around the state. In the news recently, we've seen some reports that there's another incidence of issues with raw milk and people becoming sick from consuming raw milk in the state of Florida. It's not unusual each year to see reports from different places around the country where people become sick after consuming raw milk. Sometimes this can be fairly serious. In the case in Florida, it appears that these cases have been occurring since late January, and some of these involve young children, some under the age of 10. Only about 21 people have become sick connected to this particular case. However, there may be more, as sometimes these things are not necessarily reported due to the severity of the issues that a person may have, may determine whether or not they need to be hospitalized. this case, several of the people that have become ill from consuming the raw milk have been hospitalized, and apparently at least one case has some very serious issues associated with the damage that is caused from the endotoxins that are produced by bacteria that are found in that raw milk. So, I want to just encourage everybody that, number one, the dairy products that you purchase in the grocery store, whether it be fluid milk or cheese or ice cream or other various products, are all manufactured from pasteurized milk. So that milk has been produced on farms. It was raw milk on the farm. It was hauled off the farm. It was taken to a processing plant where the milk was pasteurized. The pasteurization process kills any harmful bacteria that might be in that milk. So therefore, the products that you're purchasing in the grocery store and consuming are from pasteurized milk and are free of the organisms that might potentially cause illness. In addition, these finished products are also tested to ensure that they do not contain any traces of bacteria that might cause harm to those in consumption. Now, those that consume raw milk, will everybody get sick? Well, obviously not. In the case of Florida, there were probably hundreds, maybe thousands of people that have consumed raw milk during this time that have not become stricken. But those that are immunosuppressed or very young or very old are generally at more risk because their bodies do not have the ability to fight off the endotoxins that are produced by some of these bacteria. Does all raw milk contain bacteria that might be harmful to your health? Well, no, it doesn't. The ones that we're mostly concerned about are things like E. coli, Listeria, Salmonella, and Campylobacter are the main ones that might cause issues in humans. But we don't always find these in raw milk, and therefore some that consume raw milk will not suffer any ill effects from it. So what is the safe thing to do? Well, the safe thing to do is to only utilize products that are either pasteurized or have been manufactured from pasteurized milk. So again, the things that you purchase in the grocery store would fall into that category. It is also very important that you recognize that if you have people in your home that are immunosuppressed, or if you have very young or elderly people in your home, that you should be concerned about the potential issues that might arise due to the consumption of raw milk. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy consumers to consider utilizing only those products that are either pasteurized or have been manufactured from milk that has been pasteurized.
Thanks, Mike. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner and Chevy Lynn Vasky, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.